Hi everyone. So welcome to Module 4, where we are going to be exploring humanistic, existential, and positive psychology perspectives of personality. So with that being said, uh, let me share my screen to go over the PowerPoint for today. So again, we're continuing with clinical theories. So we started with the psychodynamics. And the psychodynamics, again, we're striving for balance. In addition to that, typically the psychodynamics have a more negative view of personality and tend to focus on limitations of one personality rather than strengths. The humanistic elements are kind of have some similarity, but try to take a more holistic and positive view of how the human being can grow and develop. So, with this, these theories are going to be rather simple to explain, but there's a lot of depth and a lot of really reflecting on what these words actually mean to us. So, with that, we're going to start the activity a little different today, where I want you to reflect on kind of someone in your life that's made a positive difference. And so, really, it can be someone even who had a very small time in your life, like a teacher or a coach, or it could be someone who has been very significant in your life, such as a friend, family member, maybe even a partner. So, think about that someone who's made a difference in your life and start reflecting on how do they make a difference? Did they provide support? Did they tell you what to do? How did they make that difference in their life? What qualities and characteristics does or did this person have? How would you describe their personality? And how do they help? What made them a good helper? What made the positive difference in your life? And what do they do to make that happen? And as you're reflecting upon this, really reflect on what was the experience interacting with a person like? How did they make you feel? And then finally, did they take a directive, a non directive, or a collaborative approach? So, what those mean is a directive approach is someone basically telling you what to do, maybe giving you advice. A non directive approach is you're the expert of your own life, and really the person's there to just kind of listen and be support. A collaborative approach is kind of working as a team to help make the positive difference. So, this activity is essentially the starting point for your assignment for module number 4. And really, I want to make it clear that it does not have to be someone who has been in your life for a long time. There has been most likely people in your life, even for a short period of time, that helped you grow and develop as a person. They assisted you in some way. Could have been a role model, again, could have been a family member, it could have been a friend, but there was someone who kind of was there to support you. And so that's kind of the reflection we're going to be refocusing on this week because the core theory of, the core element of these theories is that personality growth occurs through having supportive relationships. That's the humanistic side. So, with that, let's kind of go over the key tenets for this module. So, similar to a Jungian perspective, the humanistic approach is going to see that all individuals are born with unique potential. So, the goal of life essentially is to strive to become who we are, to meet. And part of our personality development is to become a unique individual that is unique to us rather than playing the rules and expectations of what we think we should be. So, the key with this, personalities are not going to be fixed and personalities can change and develop. That core thread is going to exist through all the clinical theories. So we talked about the trait theory and biological theories, perspectives, and there is some rigidity in looking at that. Personality is probably going to be fixed after a certain age period. It could be after the brain's developed. It could be after a certain developmental milestone, whatever it may be. But within our society, it, people tend to take the view that personality stops changing at a certain time period. Again, the clinical theories argue that personality can change no matter what the circumstance. So, the thing to remember, even when we talked about the biological perspective, is significant events can alter personality functions. So, even if we take the biological foundation that personality is a result of brain function, if there is significant trauma to the brain, like Phineas Gage, for example, that could lead to personality changes. And same from these experiences that, especially from a humanistic standpoint, not only having supportive relationships can help foster personality change, but also experiencing peak experiences, profound events, whether it's spiritual or more kind of secular, whatever it may be, we have these opportunities that we've experienced something that was so profound that it changed our worldview and it changed how we view ourselves and we view others. So, why I'm saying all this is I think, from my own opinion, that most likely many of us, or excuse me, many people in society probably do have a rather fixed personality that kind of exists once they're grown into adulthood, and that most likely will continue throughout the rest of their life. Other individuals are going to experience events, whether it's to, again, changes in brain structure, peak experiences, having a supportive relationship with someone, or even psychotherapy, whatever it may be, there will be elements of people who have experienced significant changes that is going to change and grow their personality. So, continuing with this, the foundation of humanistic perspective compared to psychodynamics, and then module 6, we're going to cover um, CBT, cognitive behavioral approaches. And with this, the humanistic theories, they see someone as a whole. So we're really not going to go deep into different uh, parts of the unconscious or use many different languages to explain traits or parts. Really, we're trying to see the individual as a whole. And so rather than seeing someone as parts or traits. With that too, again, there's going to be a movement element very similar to Adlerian, where humans are motivated to seek and make meaning in their lives. That's going to really come into play with the existential element that we're going to cover soon. Excuse me. And this, from my own clinical work, seeing people motivated to find meaning has been more prevalent in the last few years. What I mean by that is many people, even at a younger age, so historically, we used to hear, midlife crisis or existential crisis when someone enters, 40 to 60 in the age range. They may have this moment where they start questioning, okay, I've done all these accomplishments on a social realm and career realm, but really, who am I? What's my life? And really having this realization that, mortality and that they're mortal, and really focusing on what is my meaning, what is my passion, what is my legacy. Well, these thoughts that, again, in the United States, traditionally and historically would occur, again, midlife, 40 to 60, and then up. We're now seeing it with younger populations. Teenagers are having existential crisis. And this could be just the social events that are occurring in the last few years. So I think more people are becoming aware that they want a life that is meaningful, or they may be having a moment where they feel their life is not meaningful. We are in an age of nihilism, and cynicism, and no doubt those perspectives can really impact kind of this having purpose and meaning. If there is no meaning and purpose, it can be really hard to kind of have hope. So growth is going to occur when an individual is exposed to the right supporting environment. That's going to be the humanistic perspective. So again, relationships. So relationships, positive relationships are going to be key in allowing personality growth. With that too, there's going to be a responsibility piece to this. So each person has the freedom, choices, and responsibility to develop their personality. That's the existential perspective. So humanist is going to kind of feel more warm and fuzzy, very supportive. The existential perspective kind of has that warm, fuzzy feeling, but it's really kind of more of a coaching perspective of, well, you're responsible for making the who you want to become. So we have two frames of that. The environment is going to play into our personal development. And then from an existential view, we have the responsibility. If we don't like our personality in certain elements, or if we don't like the circumstances we're in, we have the responsibility and the freedom to choose and grow as a person. So really, these elements are focused on human potential instead of limitation, and strengths instead of weaknesses. So positive psychology is a movement where rather than looking at faults in one's personality, we are more focusing on their strengths and their potential rather than the flaw points. So psychodynamics tends to really focus on the flaws. We look at how one's childhood development happened and what was missing in that development. In addition, exploring dreams, fantasies, and slips of the tongues, there's a pathological negative trait to this as well. So here, this is a more positive view of humanity, where the psychodynamics, especially Freudian, tend to have a negative view of humanity. So with this, I'm sure many of you have come across Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and continuing forward, I'm sure this will come up in other classes. So this is a core foundation of humanistic theory, where the goal essentially for many of us is to get to the point to become the most that one can be, or become our unique potential. And so this is a pyramid, and it's almost, we need the foundational pieces to get to there. So the bottom is physiological needs. So this is important to remember when we're talking about personality growth, that from these models, we really need to first have someone have their basic needs met in order to build off of those components to reach their full potential. So physiological needs, water, food, shelter; safety needs, feeling a sense of personal security, feeling like there's financial security, there's, feeling comfortable reaching out to people when needed. Then that's going to add to love and belonging, having a sense of friendship, intimacy, support. And with that support, we can have internalize an element of self-respect, self-confidence, kind of seeing ourselves in a positive light, and then that can lead to self-actualization. Now, there's a lot of minutia with this model. Some people argue that once we get past safety and physiological needs, that maybe we can interplay or remove or switch around love and belonging and esteem. But really, the point is that we, in order for our personality to grow, again, from these models, is we need our basic needs met, and which allows us the opportunity to become who we want to be. And not every theory of personality change is going to agree with this, but this is kind of the core foundation. And many mental health programs focus on this first. When you're doing an assessment with someone who is seeking out mental health services, we do want to explore the physiological and the safety needs from there. And then that allows us to add other interventions that can help grow the pyramid. And so the core of the humanistic theory, as I keep kind of repeating myself, is why we want to view Maslow's hierarchy of needs is we need the right conditions in order for the personality to grow and develop. So if you go further into humanistic theory or humanistic therapies, you're going to hear this analogy so much, it's going to almost make you feel nauseous in a way. The analogy is that we have to think of an individual being like a seed, typically like an acorn. So the interesting thing about those acorns or those seeds is within them is the potential to grow into the massive tree. So, but in order for that to happen, we need the right conditions for that acorn to turn into a tree. So that means we need the right soil, and we need the right amount of sunlight, the right amount of rain, the right temporal conditions, the right environment, and the time allowed for it to grow. So that's, if we go back to the hierarchy of needs, we need the physical needs met, and we need a supporting environment for this. If we put this acorn on cement, there's not going to be the right conditions for it to grow. If we put this acorn in the desert, same kind of rule. So really, we need the right conditions for our personality to grow and develop. So continuing with this framework, again, right conditions are very important. And like I said many times before, it's going to be a positive view of human nature, that given the right conditions, the person is going to develop in someone who is a pro-social being. And I'll talk in more detail what the outcomes of the right conditions are going to look for. In addition to, in connecting this to Maslow's hierarchy of need, the humanistic models, very similar to Jungian, is that within us, there is that drive to reach that self-actualizing tendency. So in using the metaphor for the acorn, that self-actualizing tendency for the acorn would be growing into the tree. That's what the acorn wants. And so once those right conditions are there, the acorn is going to start sprouting with the goal of becoming that tree. So self-actualizing tendency is going to sound similar to the Jungian view of individuation. So really what the self-actualizing tendency is defined for is the ability, desire, and power to become whole, right? Very similar to Jungian, we want all our internal psychic frameworks and structures to be in balance. So we're going to be a whole person, we're going to be self-confident and self-determining. And with this, what's going to happen is we want congruence. Congruence from this framework is essentially defined as when a person's behaviors, emotions, and thoughts align with their self-actualizing tendency. So what that means is someone is an authentic self. What they're feeling is going to relate to how they're behaving, and they're also kind of striving to accomplish what they want to accomplish. So essentially, this congruence is similar to the Adlerian view of useful behavior rather than useless. When we're not feeling congruent, we're going to have what we call splitting. So there's going to be, within us, we have kind of this internal conflict. On one hand, we want to do one thing, on the other hand, we want to do something else. Or maybe our external behaviors don't align with our internal motivations, and so maybe there's some manipulation or even self-lying towards us. So again, we're going to be born with the potential and motivated by that potential to grow and reach our full potential. So we're born and motivated to self-actualize. So again, here's the tricky part. We have that within us, but if we don't have the right conditions, we're not going to reach those potentials. So the internal us has that motivation to grow and develop, but the external conditions, if they're not supportive enough, we're going to become stagnant and stuck. So with one of those positive conditions from this model is having a supportive interpersonal relationship. So what that means, having people or someone in your life who treats you with respect, sees you as a whole person, and almost sees that potential of growth within you. This is the core of many therapeutic relationships, or the foundation of essentially a lot of psychotherapy and counseling modalities. So again, if we do not have the right conditions, there's going to be a gap forming, and there's another slide I have of this, between our ideal self and our real self, and that's the incongruence, the splitting. We have who we are, that potential within inside us, and yet because of we're not having a supportive environment, we almost have this other self that we think we should be. So that's the split. So a lot of times that ideal self that doesn't maybe match our potential self really strives and comes from an unsupportive environment, which is going to contain social expectations and experiences, and unsupportive relationships is going to derail our self-actualizing tendency. So again, going back to the acorn, If we are put into an environment like a desert or on concrete, that's not going to be the right environment for us to grow and develop. So, to continuing with the ideal versus real self. So, the real self is the self actualizing tendency occurs. So, the acorn is going to grow into the tree. And so, with the right conditions, our real self is going to be developed and expressed. Um, what this is going to be is when someone has experienced the real self, they have a sense of value and worth, not only for themselves, but for other people. So, with this, the congruent piece, when you have the real self being expressed, is I respect myself and I respect others. I know others have value and worth, and therefore I have value and worth. It's very similar to kind of Adlerian social interest. I see myself and others on the same plane. So when we experience the real self, we know our value and worth, and we know other people's values and worth. But unfortunately, many people do not experience the right conditions to reach the real self. So the ideal self can occur. Like I said, this is when the self actualizing tendency has been derailed. So rather than having a sense of value and worth just from inherently being us, being alive, the value and worth is now seen through extrinsic means. So we get self esteem and we get kind of our ego strengthened by accomplishing external goals. So that could be having this desire in order for me to be worthy, I need a certain amount of income. Getting this degree or multiple degrees is going to make me feel better. Having a certain amount of friends, peers, etc., is going to motivate me. You see this a lot. There's many times we have this feeling that if only, we could lose a certain amount of weight, if only we had more money, if only we, read a certain book or completed a certain training or whatever it may be, this is going to make our lives happy. And we see this a lot. This is a foundation of consumer culture where we're sold that if you buy something or engage in something, this is going to make you happy. Well, it is a kind of this circular motion where we accomplish something externally and then we don't feel happy. And so we continue then to still look externally to find fulfillment, to find meaning, to find pleasure. So that's the ideal self. And really, the ideal self is going to be seen not only with buying things, but also with relationships. So if we do something, then maybe so and so will love us. Maybe so and so will give us value. Maybe so and so will give us respect. And so our self worth, rather than coming from within, comes from trying to be conditional by others. So someone will only value me under certain conditions, whether I, receive certain grades or do certain activities for them. There's conditions to my worth. So in order to understand that, in order to have value and worth, I must blank. That is kind of the ideal self coming into play. So in order for others to value me or love me, then I must accomplish this, or I must become successful, or I must, be at a certain body type, or maybe I need plastic surgery. Whatever it may be, that's more the ideal self coming into play. So when we're out of sync with our real self and more the ideal self is being activated, we're going to feel discomfort, disconnection, and distorted perceptions. And essentially, using the different clinical theories, distorted perceptions could be defenses, going back to psychodynamics. And then when we get into the cognitive theories, it could be a cognitive distortion. So our thinking becomes maladaptive when the ideal self is more being expressed. So again, how we can kind of go back on track to the self-actualizing tendency, especially when the ideal self is really what's functioning and motivating our behavior, is to have the supportive environment. So having the supportive environment, we're going to see certain outcomes that come into play. And again, as I go to the next slide, so many of the stuff does have a very warm, fuzzy feeling. is very positive, and as you can see, we're not really using a lot of technical scientific terms, and that can create this idea that this is more a philosophical base rather than an empirical base. The interesting thing and almost paradoxical thing, as I'll cover in the next slide, there is a massive amount of actual hard scientific rigor that has demonstrated the validity of this theory. And I'll cover that in the next slide. So we know from clinical uh, research going all the way back to the 1940s that if we have a supportive relationship, we're going to see different personality traits from being expressed from this. So one of that is being open to the here and now, living in the moment, being present. Just in the last decade or so, the growth of mindfulness within Western culture has really emphasized, and I'm sure you've heard it more and more, that being present and in the moment can be very beneficial for being in the here and now. And with this too, someone's going to be self-directed. So rather than relying on what the societal and social expectations of how someone should live their life, the person feels like they have the control to make the life that they want. And they're going to have a sense of personal responsibility. So, the self-direction is okay, and this is what I want in my life. Then the personal responsibility is, then it's me who has the responsibility to make it happen. And then the self-trust is, I believe I can do this. So with this too, we're also going to see someone wanting to self-explore, so understand who they are. And that is a very common outcome in the psychodynamic model, is that they're interested in learning who they are. And again, we're taking a holistic perspective. So there's many different elements of one's personality and exploring those different elements. It's also going to be acceptance of who they are and acceptance for others. And these individuals are going to be very authentic. You have this feeling that, all right, this is really who they are. There's a sense of authenticity. And then finally, there's pro-social behaviors. So not only do they see themselves as having self-worth, but they see others as having self-worth. And a lot of times, going back all the way to psychodynamics, we're going to see the mature defenses being activated. And so they're going to be helping and doing behaviors that have a more positive impact on others rather than negative. So very similar to Adler's social interests. Okay, so here is where the kind of the scientific foundation comes into play. So we talked about humanistic theory of personality. This is a clinical theory, so this is the humanistic therapy component. So humanistic, it's going to have many different names. You're going to hear it referred to as person-centered, client-centered, or Rogerian, and that's named after Carl Rogers, who's pictured in this slide. A good way to understand Carl Rogers is when you think of Carl Rogers, think of Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. They're very similar in demeanor and very similar in kind of this philosophy that given support to others, and Mr. Rogers especially saw that with children. If I can accept the child who they are, give them support, that's going to help them grow and develop. They're very nurturing. They have a very positive grandfather type quality. They're very soothing. And so they really do kind of have this authentic, nurturing self. So this clinical approach was the first evidence-based practice. So what I mean by that, going back to the last module on psychodynamics, really what was happening, how that theories were developed is they would see clients first, and then clients would talk about things, and then they would try to make sense of it afterwards. What this really was okay, rather than trying to make sense and putting a theory to what's happening, we're going to use the scientific method to kind of understand rather than relying on philosophy, social theory, and even religion to make sense of the human growth and development. So the first evidence-based practice, so what this means, it was designed to first systematically study the therapy process using surveys, so pre and post surveys, using recordings. So it was the first type of therapy to audio record and video record sessions and then measure those sessions and then use outcome measures. So this again started all the way in the 1940s with Carl Rogers and his colleagues. So they would give assessments before they saw the clients, really explore what the client's life was like, what the personality was like. Then they would track and record the sessions to see what was talked about. And there was a lot of experimentation using different approaches, different questions, different techniques to see what worked best. And so through all this kind of experimentation, going from the 1940s and then to the 1970s, really the model was kind of solidified is, okay, after almost 30 years of research, we have determined that doing these certain steps is going to really help develop and grow someone as a person. And and what's interesting, since the 1970s, when that was the humanistic therapist came up and said, this is what worked. Obviously, there was a lot of skepticism, and then the other theories and other researchers wanted to kind of disprove it. But now, after numerous attempts, the best outcome that we know that if the most guarantee for success in using a counseling and psychotherapy modality is having the therapeutic relationship. That's our best guarantee of success. That's one of the outcome measures we know for a fact. If that's present, there's a good chance it's going to be a productive experience. If we don't have that, it's rather difficult. So practicing today, every theory, or all the major theories, going from CBT, psychodynamics, humanistic, internal family systems, EMDR, the idea is we have to use these humanistic principles first, and then we can go forward to help someone grow and develop. So these models are very simple. You may have already learned some of these techniques, such as reflective listening, summarizing, and these things are rather easy to teach, but in practice, they're not easy. So it may be easy to understand, and I'm actually going to show you in the next slide, hey, this is how someone grows and develops. There's 3 steps, and I'll show you that next. But this is not easy. These are because well, let me go to the next slide. So here's the 3 steps that I can tell you how someone's going to grow and develop. And this is, again, going back all the way to the 1940s, massive amount of research has shown that if we have these 3 steps, there's going to be growth. So the first is a lot of the focus is not on the client, is not on the other person, it's on the helper. So if we go back to reflection of the helper, many times helpers who help people grow and develop use these conditions. So rather than the word therapist, you can replace helper if you would like. So the first is the helper or the therapist is congruent with the client or the helpee. So what that means is let's say I'm working with someone and the goal for them is to express their real self, be congruent to who they are. I need to be that way. And so I need to demonstrate that there is an alignment with my behaviors, my feelings, and my motivations, that I am authentic in who I am with this. So if I'm authentic, if I'm congruent, that's going to give permission as well as modeling for the other person to be authentic and congruent. The second is, and this is probably the most difficult step, is that the helper provides the helpee unconditional positive regard. So going back into a few slides ago, the ideal self is motivated to have this hoping that their worth is conditioned on certain things. So in order for them to feel worthy, they have to do something. So the opposite of that is no matter what the client or the helpee does, I'm going to have a sense of positivity and hope for them. And that's unconditional. There's nothing the client has to do in order for me to want to help them. And that can be very difficult because there's going to be testing, and sometimes people do things that may upset us. The best experience I have to explain this is if you have a new puppy or a new pet, um, that puppy, just sticking with the dog, because I've just recently got a new puppy and within this year, is damn, that puppy causes chaos, pees, poops in the house, rips things up, all this. And in those moments, yes, it can be annoying, but I still unconditionally have a positive view for that puppy. I'm still going to take care of that puppy. I still want best for that puppy. And yeah, this puppy can be a menace, but they're still seeing this unconditional positive regard that I still see hope and I still respect it for this puppy. And I'm not going to punish it. That this puppy is always going to have my unconditional love and support no matter what this puppy does. So again, this is why it's simple to explain this. This is the difficulty of it. The third step is really trying to demonstrate and understanding empathy for the helpee. So essentially, is empathy is trying to understand what someone else may be experiencing. So a good way of explaining it is empathy is having one foot in your own experience and one foot in the helpee's experience, and really trying to understand their worldview and be opening to that. So I want to understand where the person's coming from, what the person's feeling, what the person's experiencing, what the person's hopes and desires are. And really just giving that environment. And why we do that is if we can help understand what someone truly is, that allows them to understand who they are too. So those are the core conditions. Again, if you do these, you can help someone grow and change, but it is hard and it is exhausting. And so, like I said, it is simple on paper, but it's probably one of the more difficult theories and modalities to use in practice. Okay, so another element too, and some of you may have come across this already in other classes, is we can use these models with adults, but really this also can focus on child development. So Virginia Axeline is one of the main emphasis of developing humanistic principles for child development. So play therapy kind of has a lineage more in the psychodynamics. And again, in the 1940s, Virginia Axeline started to use the Rogerian principles and to help children grow and develop. I think a good way to understand these theories is reading Dibs in Search of Self. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend that book. Understand there's been a lot of change. There's been some modifications of how what we call now child-centered play therapy, of how it's practiced now to how it's practiced in the 1940s. There's been some modifications for that. But really what this is this idea that given the right conditions, we're going to provide the child to develop trust in themselves, experience themselves, take risks and responsibilities. So a lot of how children learn who they are is through play. And so if play allows them to explore, try new roles, figure out who they are, that allows them to kind of grow and develop as a person. But a lot of times within our society, play is rather restrictive. There's rules to play. And so, and there's only times when a child can do a certain type of play and it's controlled by someone else. So really they learn a lot about their expression of themselves is conditioned to certain circumstances. And in fact, a lot of times we'll see parents, caregivers, teachers redirect a child's play. So then we kind of internalize that, oh, I'm supposed to be this certain way rather than what I want to do right now. So play therapy using these models allows, you basically give space for a child to really explore who they are in that moment. So again, those two, Dibs in Search of Self and play therapy, could be some interesting resources if you have any interest in those. Okay, so moving on. So we talked about the humanistic, very positive. It's all about having a supportive environment where someone can kind of have the opportunity to learn more about themselves, having a safe psychological safety to really kind of explore more who they are and express their true self. Now we have the existential psychology. Existential psychology, essentially, the core premise of this is as a human being, we have the freedom to choose what and who we become. And so that's the premise. And no doubt the reality is there's going to be social constraints and sociological factors that come into this. But the element of this is there may be external barriers, but there is freedom with the internal world. So we could live in a very tight, restricted external environment, but that does not necessarily prevent us from making our own meaning and purpose for this. So a lot of themes that you'll hear from an existential psychology is free will, that we have the ability to choose how we make sense of something, that we're motivated for purpose, that we want responsibility, we want meaning. With that too, there's a lot of suffering. That life is suffering, and that is why we need to have meaning, purpose. There's a lot of polarity, if you can see with these words. Creativity is a key to life. There's also going to be feelings of isolation, anxiety, and then this element of death, our own mortality. So the thing to remember, and kind of giving a snapshot with this, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search of Meaning, is really one of the cornerstones of existential psychology. So for those unaware, essentially, Viktor Frankl was a therapist who was practicing before World War II. World War II happens, and he was in a concentration camp. And he was really, if we talk about an external environment where the social conditions are horrendous and there's not, that it's definitely very restrictive in a horrible place. What Viktor Frankl saw is that the individuals could have many choices of how they respond to those areas. You could let the environment consume you, and he saw that happen to people, and that no doubt he felt could increase their own mortality, wanting to give up, wanting to almost fall into this horrible, hellish, and evil system. And so what Frankl also saw was individuals who did not let these external conditions infect their internal world. And many of these people who did not allow that to happen had hope, purpose, and had a meaning to make sense of this. And they and what he was arguing was we could not control the external environment, but we had the ability to control our own internal world. And really that emphasis that we don't want the external to impinge on that freedom, that we have the freedom to make the experience what we want it to be internally. And then having meaning, having hope, having purpose. So essentially, that's the core of existential psychology, is we have the responsibility and the choice to not let the external world impact our own view of who we are. So this, I think, because this theory's foundation is so philosophical, this one I think is sometimes harder to explain. And really what I want to describe is that there is a distinction between existentialism and existential therapy. So existentialism is a late 19th century and 20th century philosophical system about meaning and purpose. So existential psychology was inspired by both existentialism and applied many concepts of those ideas in the clinical and research disciplines. So the goal of all these approaches is to connect with our aliveness and humanness. Excuse me. So what, wow, I can't talk. what's interesting with the existential psychology is it has the framework that, just being human, there are certain struggles we're going to have. One, life is suffering, is almost a very Buddhist psychology perspective. Life is suffering. And for many of us, there's not an inherent meaning. There's not a rule book giving to us to make sense of that suffering. We ourselves have to find a way to make sense of it, and that we have more choices and freedoms than we think we do. In addition to that, also another core element is that there's a lot of isolation in life. We may feel alone. What happens quite a bit in mental health therapy is many people struggling with mental health concerns may feel that they're the only person that are having these thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. And the beauty of existential therapy is realizing you're not alone. You're not the first person to have these experiences. And there's really that aliveness to kind of understand that, hey, a lot of these thoughts, feelings, and actions are just part of being human. But how do we make sense of it? How do we not let it consume us? And in addition to that, for many, it's striving to make sense of our own mortality. Death is a very strong drive, just like we talked about in psychodynamics. So I think what's hard, especially not only in this class, but teaching existential therapy to graduate students in the mental health counseling track, is this theory basically starts off very negative. Life sucks and then you die is how some people put this theory. But so what we start off is, okay, the existentialist view that there's a lot of negatives to being human, but that's the external elements that we can't control. What we can control is how we make sense of those. We can let those negative conditions really impact our sense of self to the point where we become cynical, nihilistic, and give up on life. And so really what the existentialist views is oddly enough, by exploring the darkness, very similar to Jungian, that's where we can feel alive. By having these conversations about mortality, our fears and insecurities, gives us this opportunity to really explore and experience what it means to be human. And so from an existential view, the role of the therapist is this idea to inspire hope. The hope that the client will, or the person can find meaning to make sense of all these experiences. And so I've used existential therapy quite a bit. It's one of my theories I align with. And what I've experienced with working with clients is, and from my own counseling and experience, a lot of these existential concerns and crises are going to occur throughout our life. Yet, what I found is if we explore and sit with these concerns and talk them out with other people and try to find a meaning with that, it doesn't make the existential crises go away. They're still going to come up in life. But by talking about it, it's going to be easier the next time it comes. Very similar to the Jungian view of the spiral. We're always going to have times of going into the abyss. But if we can get through it, it's going to strengthen us and it's going to help us to continue through that abyss next time. We're going to have these crises throughout our life. But if we explore and find meaning with it, it's going to, and have the responsibility to get through it, what we also call resilience, and that's going to help us. It's going to be less difficult each time. So, and really, the thing too with the existential therapy, why we attach this to this theory, or excuse me. So let me rephrase that. Why existential theory is attached a lot to humanistic and positive psychology is existential theory is like a parasitic parasite. It needs another host to sustain itself because there's really not much to existential therapy. Yeah, you have Basically, there's negatives of living life, but hey, if you make meaning for it, that's how you're going to grow and develop. Okay. There's not really a lot of specific techniques that use. There's not a lot of major research that's done on this. There's a lot of literature from the philosophical side, but from within the social sciences, we typically attach it to the humanistic theories. Um, and because it is essentially about um, really just having hope for the other person that they can make sense of what life is supposed to be for them. And that's going to no doubt help them reach their potential. So this is more the framework going in a little deeper. Um, from this perspective, the existential framework has a lot of kind of opinions of how humans tend to be. So humans tend to avoid the uncomfortableness of who they really are, and that can lead to unauthentic living. So again, the big theme with the humanistic theories, we want someone living their true self. So the existentials is like, yep, we're on board for that. And that's why they kind of grab on to the humanistic theories. And then they just argue that, yeah, people tend to avoid uncomfortableness, and that makes them authentic. So we need to understand that we have the choice and the responsibility in the development of our lives. So if we don't like something about ourselves, then rather than relying on the external situation to change, we can only really change ourselves. And we can really address that kind of component. And so with that too, the existentialists argue that people tend to avoid uncomfortableness, and they're making that choice to avoid the uncomfortableness. And so really there could be a responsibility piece and a choosing piece to know that by exploring the uncomfortableness, that's where we grow and develop. Again, very similar to Jungian. I explore the shadow, I could find the gold in the shadow. But really what comes up a lot is the uncomfortableness are just biological sensations and emotional sensations that are really, really uncomfortable. And so anxiety, dread, and fear can really make us want to avoid certain circumstances. Avoidance of a fear response is how a phobia can develop. Let's say I'm afraid of a dog, and every time I see a dog, I avoid it, that's just going to strengthen my fear. Or, excuse me, cover that in the behavioral theories. So the existentialists argue that if we explore the anxiety, dread, and fear, that's actually where creativity and personal growth occur. So again, it's not pathological. Very similar to the Jungian view that symptoms are not necessarily pathology, but opportunities to grow. That a lot of to address those anxiety, dread, and fear can be seen as ways to motivate us to create something new. So creativity is a key element to our personality growth. So creativity could be, getting into arts or crafts. It also could be finding a way of being creative in a situation that may not feel like it has many options. And so it could be, that's another element of creativity. It allows us to kind of get out of a rigid framework. And so really the core element of existential psychology is everyone is responsible for developing higher degrees of meaning and well-being in their lives. So the humanistics argue it's about the environment. Having the supportive environment is what's going to help one grow and develop. The existentialists kind of take the other framework that the person has a responsibility for developing higher degrees of meaning and well-being. So that means that the person is responsible in finding those supportive environments, and also the person is responsible for continuing on the path to finding meaning and well-being. And what's, I think, difficult in applying existential therapy is everyone is going to have a unique meaning and well-being. And I can't tell you what is going to be meaningful for you. I can't do that, because if I tell you what's meaningful for you, it may not be authentic. And really what's interesting with this is things are more impactful when you discover it on your own. So, for a lot of existential therapy techniques is really promoting this idea of exploring novelty. Um, you see this a lot in career counseling. A lot of people are like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I'm not sure what it is. And that can be really frustrating. And many times people want an assessment, some sort of test, or some sort of career counselor to tell them, hey, you should become this. The existential argue that's not going to be helpful. What we can do is help a person find the courage to find that meaning. So, a lot of times, how we're going to learn what's meaningful and purposeful is by experiencing different things. So, the core, I think, of many of these theories is not only the sense of um, openness to experiences, but also this idea that we need balance in our lives. It's very, very easy to become very rigid in things and kind of go through kind of the cycle of life. But rather, when personality is going to grow and develop, is we have to somehow stop the routine and find new experiences. That's what all the clinical theories essentially talk about is in order to grow as a person, we need to get out of the routine and try new things. So, finally, to sum up all of this, we've talked about humanistic theory, where the environment and the supportive relationships is going to help grow and develop as a person. Existential psychology essentially is that um, we're going to grow as a person when we deal with the uncomfortableness of being a person and that we have the responsibility to grow. No one else can make that happen, essentially. Again, it kind of contradicts humanistic theory, but you could argue that the existentialists would say if you find the right, if you're, let me rephrase that. A good old, very common conversation in existential therapy is exploring your peer group and realizing you're choosing the friends you have and you're a reflection of your friends. There's an old pop psychology saying that you're the amalgamation of the 5 closest people in your life. I think there's some truth in that. So, this idea that the existentials argue it's your responsibility for finding the supportive relationships to make you grow as a person. So, now we're into the positive psychology. So, humanistic, very soothing, very tender. The existentials is very tough love. And then positive psychology is really focusing on wellness. So we're removing the negative elements and we're focusing on strengths rather than weakness or limitations. So positive psychology argues that we can still grow as a person by developing our strengths. It can really help us grow. So we'll focus on understanding what provides meaning and happiness in individual lives, has a more optimistic view of what it means to be human and the potential to grow. And it also really emphasizes that there's going to be barriers in our life, and those barriers are going to provide opportunities for growth and development. And when we overcome those barriers, we gain meaning. So, again, that's another core theme that has come up with many different theories. Life is going to have barriers. We can let those barriers consume us, and that's going to create stagnation. Or if we view the framework or reframe it, and that's going to be a cognitive therapy technique we'll talk in module 6. If we reframe barriers in situations rather than being negative but an opportunity to grow, that may help us overcome those barriers. And we overcome those barriers, we gain meaning. We develop a new understanding of who we are. We develop self-esteem, self-respect, and we internalize this idea that we can do this, we can overcome things, and that's resilience. So this is the last slide. Let me stop sharing. Okay. There's a lot to these theories. Again, to summarize, humanistic theory, we grow and develop through the environment that we're in. Existential is we have the responsibility and the choice to grow and develop as a person by exploring the uncomfortableness of just being human, and that we may not be able to change external factors, but we always have the choice and freedom to change our internal perspectives. Positive psychology is focusing on Let's focus on strengths rather than weaknesses. And if we can help people overcome barriers, that's how they're going to find meaning in their life. So again, uh, all I want to say is, yeah, so the assignment is really just reflecting on someone who has helped you grow and develop as a person, and really even small little experiences, and maybe someone who was in your life for a very short time can still have a significant impact. So with that being said, I hope to have a good rest of your day.